truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Monday, June 24th, 2024, the 1251st day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month, and in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You will be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you'll be invited to participate in the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin. And you feel better about precious metals? I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company. And that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so we are in what has to be probably one of the biggest political news weeks of this entire year. And this is going to be a year with lots of big political news weeks. In fact, we've had a whole lot of them already, but I'm not sure how any is going to stack up to this week. So we have Supreme Court decisions Wednesday, Thursday, and potentially even Friday this week. on some really big cases. And I'm not sure if we're going to be able to go through all of them at any depth on this show, although I will try. I would like to get to all of them. And we're going to go through a summary of them in just a second. But then we also have the American political freakout about the debate on Thursday. And so, assuming that I'll spend time on the show on Friday talking about the debate, I want to spend some time talking about that as well. But let's get started here with the post-millennial. There is a Zero Hedge article like this talking about 6 of the cases, but this one goes through all 10. And that's what I call a bonus. The headline is, Final 10 cases of SCOTUS term include major decisions on Trump, J6 cases, and social media censorship. And they lead it off with Trump versus the United States. The most anticipated decision will likely be Trump v. United States, a case stemming from the J6 case brought by the Biden administration's Department of Justice against former President Donald Trump, a man, they note, who is running to unseat the Attorney General's boss. They're talking, of course, about the Jack Smith trial here. The DOJ contends that after the 2020 election, which saw Biden as the president-elect, Trump, quote, pursued unlawful means of discounting legitimate votes and subverting election results, end quote, thereby engaging in, quote, 3 criminal conspiracies, end quote. The alleged conspiracies were A conspiracy to defraud the United States by using dishonesty, fraud, and deceit to impair, obstruct, and defeat the lawful federal government function by which the results of the presidential election are collected, counted, and certified by the federal government. So you're not allowed to lie about election fraud, is what is being contended by Jack Smith. What that means, of course, is that you are not allowed to challenge the results of elections, even if the election theft is done in broad daylight and the reported results are preposterous. 81 million real, lawful American votes. B, a conspiracy to corruptly obstruct and impede the January 6th congressional proceeding at which the collected results of the presidential election are counted and certified. And C, a conspiracy against the right to vote and to have one's vote counted. Trump brought a motion saying his actions were undertaken under his official capacity as president, official presidential acts, and that he was immune from prosecution, and that the Congress had already tried to impeach him for the same things. The questions presented to the court were 1, whether the doctrine of absolute presidential immunity includes immunity from criminal prosecution for a president's official acts, i.e. those performed within the outer perimeter of his official responsibility. So basically, the things he chooses to do as president that may be wrong or may be political, but still fall within the purview of executing his official duties. And 2, whether the impeachment judgment clause and principles of double jeopardy foreclose the criminal prosecution of a president who has been impeached and acquitted by the U.S. Senate for the same and or closely related conduct that underlies the criminal charges. And as always, it's important to remember to focus on the issue and whether or not it's principled, as opposed to how the media presents the decision in terms of whether it's good or bad for Donald Trump or any other political cause. I've said many times we want to know the rules by which we have to play. We're going to be okay playing under any set of rules, but we want to know what the rules are so that the rules can be maintained. And a ruling that might seem like it benefits us now, but does not actually reflect a constitutionally justifiable position, well, then that's just going to allow opportunities in the future for this decision to be overturned on the basis of the same unsupportable principle being now baked into precedent. Let's say the court decides a president cannot be criminally tried for an issue he was already impeached over. Well, then couldn't a corrupt uniparty Congress and Senate use an impeachment to protect a corrupt actor from criminal charges on the same issues after they leave office? Let's continue. Moyle versus United States. The issue in Moyle is whether or not Idaho's anti-abortion law is in conflict with the federal requirements that hospitals must provide abortions in emergency cases. After Idaho criminalized most abortions, the state was sued by the Biden administration under a law requiring any hospital that received federal funding must provide necessary and stabilizing treatment for an emergency medical condition, including abortion, per the EMTALA, or Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act. Idaho said that their law already provides for abortion in the event that a mother's life is at risk, and their law does not need to be expanded to cover additional health risks. Now, Idaho sounds like it has a point there, and it also sounds like the federal government is forcing hospitals to provide abortion services, even if all of the employees of that hospital are morally opposed to it, and the law says that service won't be performed. It sounds like an attempt to expand the definition of emergency to include things beyond that which might have life or death consequences for the mother. And by virtue of that, the federal government would encroach on the state of Idaho's ability to enact their own laws, thereby creating a de facto right to abortion at the federal level that comes about by leveraging public funds that are, of course, conjured out of thin air and backed by nothing more than the extended indentured servitude of each and every one of the American people. But let's continue. City of Grants Pass v. Johnson. This case will determine if a locality can make a law banning homeless people from sleeping in the street even when shelter space is not available. The court previously ruled in 1962 it is cruel and unusual punishment to make it illegal to be addicted to drugs. Plaintiffs argue that homelessness, like drug addiction, is a condition the accused should not be punished for. A ruling will determine if cities can clear the homeless from the streets or if they must be allowed to set up camp wherever. So is it cruel and unusual punishment to make it illegal to sleep outside? Well, as someone who lived in Los Angeles for many years and lived in Hollywood throughout 2020, right in the heart of Hollywood, with a major homeless encampment not 100 yards from my garage, and someone who paid attention to the homeless issue in California for many years and followed what the government in California was trying to do to, quote unquote, resolve the problem, and how often they asked for money to resolve that problem while the problem never got fixed. For real, the last time I checked, they were trying to spend $700,000 per one unit of homeless housing. It was a boondoggle. And I also observed how they would easily and quickly clean all the homeless people off the streets and make it look like none of it had ever happened every time there was an award show in Los Angeles. They didn't want the important people seeing that there was actually a homeless problem. So I would like to see how this turns out. I started looking for information and I ended up on johnsonvgrantspass.com. The site is hosted by an organization called the National Homelessness Law Center, and the homepage links directly to a webinar hosted by that group, the ABA Commission on Homelessness and Poverty, and the Southern Poverty Law Center. So this is as left-wing as can be. This is the main text on the homepage. On April 22nd, 2024, the Supreme Court of the United States heard the case of Johnson v. Grants Pass. This sets the stage for the most significant Supreme Court case about the rights of homeless people in decades. At its core, this case will decide whether cities are allowed to punish people for things like sleeping outside with a pillow or blanket, even when there are no safe shelter options. A decision will be made by June 30th, 2024. Johnson v. Grants Pass is a court case originally filed in 2018 that determined it is cruel and unusual punishment to arrest or ticket people for sleeping outside when they have no other safe place to go. The case started in Grants Pass, Oregon, when the city began issuing tickets to people sleeping in public, even when there were not enough safe, accessible shelter beds. And it's worth mentioning, by the way, that for the people bringing the case here and anyone who would use this ruling as a justification to have people sleeping on the streets, we have to remember that their capacity issues are self-reported, just like the occupancy in hospitals during the very deadly pandemic when we were told they were all overflowing at 95% capacity. And it turned out that was only true because they had lowered the capacity intentionally to be able to share that. To this day, I have zero knowledge of any case at any point where anyone had to be triaged for COVID care. There just wasn't any way to care for that person. Again, they're trying to create a de facto law situation here where no one can actually prosecute anyone for homeless anywhere as long as there is a claim that runs alongside it saying there was no other shelter available. Well, what about rural communities and suburban communities that have no homeless people anywhere? And they never have had homeless people anywhere, and so they don't have homeless shelters. They don't have housing for homeless people, and then all of a sudden, let's just say, for instance, that the Uniparty decided to release people from its prisons due to COVID, or one of their crazy businesses that employs illegal alien slave labor and houses them is, for instance, shut down, and the illegal aliens can no longer be housed there, and so they're moved to this community that has no homeless shelter. Or let's say they realize that putting a bunch of homeless people in a community is a good way to turn that whole city commie really fast and waste tons of money on public projects to house all these people. Well, they can't be arrested. They can't be ticketed for being homeless as long as there's no shelter available. And then shelter availability becomes the key factor in deciding whether or not homelessness is illegal. We are being told that the availability of homeless shelters is a key factor in understanding whether or not something constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. And here, by the way, is the text of the Eighth Amendment. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Here is Wikipedia's brief summary on the Eighth Amendment. It states that cruel and unusual punishments shall not be inflicted. The general principles that the United States Supreme Court relied on to determine whether or not a particular punishment was cruel and unusual were determined by Justice William Brennan. In Furman v. Georgia, in 1972, Justice Brennan, concurring, wrote, "There are then four principles by which we may determine whether a particular punishment is cruel and unusual. The essential predicate is, quote, that a punishment must not, by its severity, be degrading to human dignity, end quote, especially torture." Now, homelessness may be degrading to human dignity, but I'm not sure in any way that it is punishment. Is the argument that being punished for being homeless is degrading to human dignity? I mean, I guess it might be. A severe punishment that is obviously inflicted in wholly arbitrary fashion certainly does not seem to be that. A severe punishment that is clearly and totally rejected throughout society, well, definitely isn't that. A severe punishment that is patently unnecessary, it does not seem to be that either. He reasoned, the function of these principles, after all, is simply to provide the means by which a court can determine whether the challenged punishment comports with human dignity. They are therefore interrelated, and in most cases, it will be their convergence that justify the conclusion that a punishment is cruel and unusual. The test, then, will ordinarily be a cumulative one if a punishment is usually severe. If there is a strong possibility that it is inflicted arbitrarily, it is substantially rejected by contemporary society, and if there is no reason to believe that it serves any penal purpose more effectively than some less severe punishment, then the continued infliction of that punishment violates the command of the clause that the state may not inflict inhuman and uncivilized punishments upon those convicted of crimes. To me, this sounds like a very strange case to be brought in the first place. But let's conclude the summary from the Johnson v. Grants Pass website. Grants Pass, like many cities in America, is thousands of housing units short of what is needed. That shortfall will not be solved by putting more people in jail or issuing more tickets. The solution to homelessness is safe, decent, and affordable housing for everybody. So when I saw that, I was like, wait a second, how can this be? Grants Pass is thousands of housing units short of what is needed? I had never even heard of Grants Pass before this case. It turns out that Grants Pass is the 15th largest city in Oregon with a population of about 40,000 people. And we're being told that thousands of homeless people can't find shelter in Grants Pass? How is it even possible that thousands of homeless people are in Grants Pass? You have to wonder if it was just a location targeted to bring a case like this. This is from opb.org, which is an Oregon-based website that hosts a page committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The headline on this, it's from last December. As Grants Pass awaits Supreme Court decision, cities' struggle with homelessness continues. And of course, it has to. It would be a terrible thing to have your Supreme Court case centered around shelter availability and then find out there's actually no homeless people who need shelter. But I'm just going to start about halfway down the article. For years, Western cities forewent investments in shelter capacity, housing, mental health services, and addiction treatment in favor of pushing the unhoused to certain neighborhoods and prosecuting them, according to a court document filed by plaintiffs in the case in December 2023. So it's not just shelter capacity. They also want mental health services and addiction treatment services. So you've got a housing issue, a mental health issue, and a drug issue, and they're trying to conflate all of this. You have to start to wonder if this is part of that program where they hand out free drugs to people. And because they've already made society so hopeless, the people are more than happy to have the free drugs. And when they end up sleeping out on the street, well, you can't just leave them there. And yes, of course, the uniparty left has created this problem. But if they're not the best people to solve it, then who is? But although Grants Pass might want to force its unhoused residents into neighboring jurisdictions, the document reads, quote, what happens when those jurisdictions push them back by imposing an even more uncomfortable set of penalties, setting off an escalating banishment race among municipalities across the West Coast? In Grants Pass, there are various causes of this crisis. It's basically too many people, not enough housing, said Doug Walker, a member of the city's Housing Advisory Committee and former builder. Oh, a builder wants to make more houses and is on the Housing Advisory Committee. Interesting. There's been tremendous in-migration to the West Coast, to Grants Pass, over the last 20 to 40 years, and we've been underbuilding at incredible rates. And they show a picture of Doug Walker in work clothes behind his van that has tools in it. And I'm certainly not trying to insult builders, and I'm certainly not trying to insult Doug Walker. I grew up in a small town. I know builders who have this sort of setup. I doubt that Doug Walker is trying to change laws on behalf of his own building business, but that does not mean that no one else is. Now, you might remember last week we talked about how all of these red states were supposedly turning blue because of all the people moving from the West Coast back to red states. They'd had enough of California, for sure, and enough of Seattle and Portland, for sure. And while I'm certain that the life in Grants Pass is nothing like the life in Los Angeles or Seattle or Portland, in-migration to the West Coast in general does not create a homeless problem. People who are migrating in because they want to live in those states, or because they're moving out of cities, or because of economic concerns or a job that brought them there, are not going to arrive in a city that can't house them. And if we're talking about a migration pattern over 20 to 40 years, then the same would be true and people would be building to meet the housing need. Have people just been sleeping outside for 20 years waiting for the houses to go up? He said housing construction, particularly workforce housing, has not kept pace with the population growth. Without enough housing, people are priced out of the market. Workforce housing. Grants Pass has been identified by Oregon Housing and Community Services as severely rent burdened, with nearly a third of tenants spending more than half their income on rent. Other nearby cities considered to be rent burdened include Medford and Klamath Falls. According to the city's 2021 housing needs analysis, Grants Pass will need to grow by 4,000 units at a variety of income levels between 2020 and 2040 to accommodate population growth. That's nearly an increase of 28% over the city's current number of approximately 14,000 households, according to its 2023 housing production strategy. Now, earlier I said, how could they possibly have thousands of homeless people in a city of 40,000 people? It doesn't make sense. And so I looked and I found that there were about 600 people in a city of 40,000 in Grants Pass. That still doesn't make sense. I've seen it listed elsewhere as 1,200 people. All of those numbers sound extraordinarily high, but we are being told they need thousands of units and that they need it over the course of the next 16 years to accommodate future demand for housing. So is that an economic thing where they know that businesses are coming into the community, which means workers and families will follow, which increases the need for housing? Well, that doesn't seem to be the case, although they must have future plans. Again, normal market conditions usually respond to those sorts of needs and don't require public housing projects. It sounds to me like they are trying to have the ability to force cities around the country to spend in an unlimited fashion on housing projects anytime they can create a homeless problem in that city. And when you're trying to import millions of foreigners and place them in workforces all around the country, you have to start wondering if that's the part of the agenda that requires all this housing. And it's not just concern for economic growth in a city. Grants Pass is in southwestern Oregon, a few hours north of the Bay Area. Now, it's worth mentioning that it could also be possible they're just making up these numbers about future housing needs in order to make the argument in their Supreme Court case seem much stronger than it is. This does seem to center around creating a de facto right to homelessness and a tool to force cities and states to fund massive housing projects. Moody v. Net Choice and Net Choice v. Paxton. A ruling in these two cases out of Florida and Texas in regard to laws passed in these states would determine whether social media giants can censor speech. The laws passed in these two states addressed complaints that platforms such as Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube censored speech from conservative users. The Supreme Court temporarily blocked Texas's law on the matter in 2022. The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals blocked Florida's version of the bill, which fines social media platforms for blocking politicians' posts in 2021. And I have a feeling like we will be doing a full episode on the social media cases at some point this week or next. The other one, of course, is Murthy v. Missouri. In the case of Murthy, Republican attorneys general, as well as social media users, argued that Surgeon General Murthy and the Biden administration worked in coordination in order to pressure social media companies into taking down specific content related to COVID-19. The challengers contended that posts on Facebook, YouTube, and X had been suppressed due to government pressure on social media companies. They say the posts were censored in violation of the First Amendment. In 1963, the Supreme Court ruled in Bantam Books v. Sullivan that informal and indirect efforts by the government to suppress speech can violate the First Amendment. And as someone who has been banned and censored on social media platforms by the government, I certainly am interested in the outcome of these cases. But we've discussed them all before, and as I said, I'm sure we're going to discuss them again very soon. Harrington v. Purdue Pharma. The Purdue Pharma Company was the maker of OxyContin, which was the prescription drug scourge of the nation prior to fentanyl. And it's amazing, isn't it, that we just have one of those right after the next? A previous ruling found the company liable for aiding the rampant overprescription and consumer drug abuse of the painkiller. The company paid billions, but the Sackler family behind the company were shielded from liability. This case will determine if a bankruptcy plan can legally be structured to protect a third party from being prosecuted civilly. And you can imagine that this case will set important precedent for the future when these transnational corporations are held accountable for what it is they've done. The pharmaceutical companies, for instance, the media companies, for instance, and you can just keep going. Loper Bright Enterprises v. Raimundo and Relentless v. Department of Commerce. These cases relate to the 40-year-old ruling in the case of Chevron USA v. Natural Resources Defense Council, which stated that courts should, quote, defer to an agency's reasonable interpretation of an ambiguous statute, end quote. The two cases were filed in January in response to a rule issued by the National Marine Fisheries Service requiring the herring industry to pay the costs of observers on a fishing boat. a ruling against Chevron, one of the most cited cases in American law, would overturn the decision and shift power from agencies to judges and Congress. This would immediately disarm the administrative state and dismantle one of their most powerful weapons against the people when it comes to implementing this global communist agenda. The situation as it exists now that Chevron doctrine protects is the Congress delegates some authority to the agency and then lets the agency make all the relevant decisions. That agency's decisions then are viewed by the court as carrying the weight of law as if the Congress had passed that particular rule or regulation, made that particular decision themselves. And the issue with the herring fisheries, the government decided that a regulator should be on the ship with the company and that the company has to pay for it. How's that for a threat to business, a hidden tax, and a government jobs program all wrapped up in one? Securities and Exchange Commission v. Jarkissi. A ruling in the SEC case will determine whether the commission's in-house administrative courts are lawful. A ruling against the SEC would require it to file cases in federal court and could affect administrative tribunals at other agencies, including the FTC, the IRS, the EPA, and others. George Jarkissi, who says he has been wrongly prosecuted by the SEC, is asking that the court rule that people facing civil fraud complaints from the SEC have the right to a jury trial in federal court under the Seventh Amendment. So basically, all of the agencies of the federal bureaucracy that bring charges and try their own cases, they wouldn't be allowed to do that anymore. It's rather unbelievable that they were ever allowed to do it to begin with. Let's take a quick look at an article from Bloomberg Law. What happens to the SEC's administrative proceedings after Jarkissi? And let's go down just to the conclusion. Regardless of the outcome, the SEC is likely to continue to settle a significant number of its cases in an administrative forum, largely because subjects of SEC investigations often want to settle in an administrative forum. Sounds like the SEC was handed a significant amount of authority and control through this process, especially knowing most of the people they would bring charges against would want to settle. It's pretty easy to create an extortion racket that way, where companies will simply settle rather than disrupting their normal flow of business. Cease and desist orders are generally considered less severe or blameworthy than a district court injunction. The standard for obtaining a C&D order is less demanding than for an injunction. The parties also avoid the risk that a district court judge might question the terms of the settlement. So they basically have free rein. Administrative claims can be based on such concepts as willful conduct and causing a violation, which generally have lower standards of culpability than district court analogs. Unless the court or Congress limits the legal ability to resolve cases in an administrative forum, this practice is likely to continue. Ironically, if Jarkissi is overruled, it could have a significant practical effect on the SEC. In light of the challenge to the administrative law judges, the SEC has been behaving as if it had already lost this case. It is bringing only a handful of litigated cases before its administrative law judges, mainly seeking remedies that are only available in that forum. If the court were to reverse Jarkissi, the SEC would likely bring more litigated cases in its administrative forum and again seek penalties there. On the other hand, the court may take the opportunity to narrow the scope of public rights under Atlas Roofing, that is the referenced case for precedent. Perhaps, for example, that they encompass only government benefits. If the court goes further and finds that the Seventh Amendment extends to any deprivation of liberty or property by the federal government, virtually all litigated claims for most remedies would need to be pursued before juries in federal district court. Finally, if the court were to rule this way and the statutes authorizing administrative remedies were struck down or removed by Congress, the SEC's ability to settle cases in an administrative forum would be curtailed or foreclosed. While this may not be the most likely outcome, it would indeed signal a significant change to the quote-unquote administrative state. And finally, Ohio v. Environmental Protection Agency. The Supreme Court in this case will rule on the Biden administration's Good Neighbor plan and whether it should continue. The plan requires factories and power plants in the Midwest and West to cut air pollution that drifts eastward into other states through the prevailing winds. The Supreme Court in 2014 ruled in a separate case that an EPA regulation intended to cut down on cross-state pollution was permissible. So essentially, it sounds like it's about turning the entire nation into what they have in California, Oregon, and Washington when it comes to their environmental laws. They basically agreed that whatever environmental standards were passed in one state, those standards must be met by the other state. So whatever state can pass the most extreme standards, well, the other two states have to do that too. It's basically a formal understanding that your states have to change laws at the behest of unelected agencies of other states. And this sounds like the federal version of that. If they pass an environmental law in one place, any state that interacts will have to pass the same law. And just imagine how much power this would give the federal government. I am very hopeful that we will see a Supreme Court that chips away at this administrative state and this government overreach that we've been dealing with. Now, I don't know if we're going to get great decisions on any of these. I hope we get great decisions on all of them that work toward restoring the original understanding of the Constitution and the protection of rights that we were told we were guaranteed. Now, you have to wonder how much all of this will get lost in the shuffle as we move toward the end of this week and the debate is at the forefront of everyone's minds. It's certainly going to be a massive television event for anyone who is concerned with the political news and the battle over who might win rigged elections. People are worried about how Donald Trump's performance against the fake president Joe Biden might change people's opinions of these two men and cause them to do something different 4.5 months from now that determines the outcome of a rigged election. But rather than considering this a battle between Trump and Biden, where the future of the United States depends on the outcome of this TV show, let's assume that Donald Trump is going to be just fine, because he's always just fine, and look instead to the fact that the other people besides Trump will be put on center stage before the nation who's mostly tuned out Joe Biden, certainly in any long form, and who've mostly tuned out the media. And so we will come back around to that point, but let's start with the New York Times. This is from today. In this debate, CNN is the decider. The primetime matchup on Thursday between President Biden and former President Donald J. Trump represents an evening full of promise and peril, especially for CNN. For the first time in decades, a single television network will have sole discretion over the look, feel, and cadence of a general election presidential debate. Unlike in past years when an independent, nonprofit commission oversaw the contests, CNN has picked the moderators, designed the set, and will choose the camera angles that viewers see. Wow. Lest any voters forget who's in charge, the red CNN logo will be ubiquitous. Rival channels seeking to simulcast the event had to agree to leave the network's on-air watermark untouched. The debate at 9 p.m. Eastern could be the single most watched moment of the presidential campaign, with consequences that ripple all the way to November. And much of the credit or the blame for what transpires on tens of millions of screens on Thursday will land at CNN's feet. Leaders at the channel, which has endured a run of poor ratings and viewer apathy, say they don't mind the pressure. The fact that we got it was something of a moment for us, Mark Thompson, who became CNN's chairman in October, said in an interview between prep meetings in Washington. Much of the reaction of the public, the rest of the media, and other politicians is going to depend on President Trump and President Biden, who are the stars of the show, end quote. CNN outmaneuvered its competitors to land the event after Mr. Biden said in May that he would not cooperate with the Commission on Presidential Debates, which had sponsored general election debates since 1987. Instead, Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump agreed to meet under the auspices of individual networks. A second matchup is scheduled for September on ABC. Within the cutthroat TV news industry, the debate is seen as an enormous marketing coup for CNN. which even at the time of austerity for cable television has stood out for ignominious reasons. The channel is currently on track for its lowest rated month in primetime since 1991, with fewer than 100,000 average viewers a night among adults 25 to 54, according to Nielsen. And that is rather amazing. And the last time CNN hosted a major televised political event at a New Hampshire town hall last May, it was widely perceived as a debacle. Mr. Trump unleashed a barrage of falsehoods and insulted his interlocutor, earning whoops from an audience of partisans who jeered the CNN anchor on stage. Yes, because Trump was right and Caitlin Collins was embarrassing herself. The CNN leader behind that evening, Chris Licht, was fired a month later. Thursday's debate is a significant test for his successor, Mr. Thompson, a former chief executive of the New York Times and director general of the BBC. Mr. Thompson, a Briton who recently became a dual American citizen, said that he had looked to the 1960 Kennedy-Nixon debates for inspiration. I wanted to return to a very simple, classical format, Mr. Thompson said. Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump will meet in a closed studio in Atlanta with no live audience. Each candidate's microphone will be muted when it is not his turn to speak. It's been done in a way, at least in principle, that is designed to get as much light as possible and not to be overwhelmed with heat, Mr. Thompson said. Best laid plans, though, have a way of going out the window when it comes to live television. The first meeting of Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump in 2020 devolved into chaos as Mr. Trump flouted the ground rules and relentlessly interrupted his opponent. The former president has also regularly accused CNN of bias. On Thursday, much of the focus will be on the moderators, Dana Bash and Jake Tapper, and their ability to keep proceedings on track. Neither anchor has moderated a general election debate, but they both have experience at various Republican and Democratic primary debates sponsored by CNN, including an audience-free bout between Mr. Biden and Senator Bernie Sanders in March 2020. The role of a moderator is often in dispute, and David Chalian, CNN's political director, said that Thursday's live debate, quote, is not the ideal arena for live fact-checking, end quote. Instead, Ms. Bash and Mr. Tapper would focus on, quote, facilitating the debate between these candidates, not being a participant in that debate, he said, noting that CNN analysts would assess the veracity of the candidates' comments immediately after the telecast. Now let's remember for just a second who David Chalian is. Here is Chalian speaking of Joe Biden's fake inauguration.
There's still some tinkering going on with the inaugural address, but his aides have made really clear it's not like he's trying to ignore or paper over either what happened at the Capitol 2 weeks ago or what we've been through throughout 4 years of the Trump presidency. And the contrast on display tonight was so stark. I mean, those lights that are just shooting out from the Lincoln Memorial along the reflecting pool, it's like almost extensions of Joe Biden's arms embracing America. It was a moment where the new president came to town and sort of convened the country in this moment of remembrance, outstretching his arms. And contrast that with that video you just saw of a disgraced president on his way out at his lowest point in his presidency at the very end here by himself, fighting for his political movement to live on, and not even necessarily promising that he's going to be leading that movement.
Now, I don't know how D.C. is today, but I was in D.C. in March of 2023 for a CPAC, and it seemed like a largely abandoned city. Trump often describes it as a dump, and his description is rather accurate. It remains to be seen how Dana Bash and Jake Tapper will do with refraining from inserting the fake news over Donald Trump when he speaks, and I think we might end up seeing a lot of that. But we should at least stay open to the possibility that they will adhere to some sort of strict set of rules for whatever reason. And I'll come back around to that. CNN's efforts will play out on virtually every major television outlet. It is offering other networks a free simulcast of its debate, albeit with stipulations that have irked some rivals. One requirement is that any mention of the event, including on-screen program guides, must include CNN in the title. CNN even distributed a specific graphic to be used for promotions, complete with a pair of giant CNN logos and a tiny blank space allotted for other networks to include their own branding. The other networks must also accommodate one of the biggest changes in CNN's production: advertisements. General election debates have not previously included ads, a precedent set by CBS, which produced the very first televised debate in 1960. At the same time, though, Robert Sarnoff, then the president of NBC, argued otherwise. It is an antiquated notion that a so-called public service program is not a public service if it is sponsored, Mr. Sarnoff wrote. By this odd reasoning, a broadcaster cannot serve the public unless he loses money. Now, I think that's probably an interesting point worth exploring. I don't want to spend the time doing it today. CNN apparently agreed. The channel will interrupt Thursday's 90-minute event with 2 ad breaks, each set to last 3.5 minutes. Under the simulcast rules, other networks cannot feature their own news anchors during those breaks, though they are free to sell their own ads. And that's quite interesting because I think a picture might be emerging here, but let's continue. The writer Nell Minow, a daughter of Newton Minow, who devised the first televised events in 1960, noted in an interview that TV networks are ultimately commercial enterprises. Let's face it, they have shareholders and they operate as businesses, she said. While her father, who died last year, preferred that an independent commission administer the presidential debates, Ms. Minow said that he would be happy one was happening at all. They are the only time we get to see the candidates without being shiny and buffed up by their advisors, she said. If they sit down with Putin or Netanyahu, this is the person we're going to see. Well, that is a strange framing. And of course, Joe Biden's not going to be sitting down with any world leaders. He hasn't even talked to Putin in years. And of course, that's because he is not a real president. There is some history of networks struggling to balance commercial imperatives with the civic duty of carrying debates. In 1988, NBC objected when the Debate Commission proposed a date in September that conflicted with the Seoul Summer Olympics. At a contentious meeting, one NBC executive locked eyes with a commission member and intoned, "Miss, I don't think you understand. The Olympics only take place every 4 years." Ha 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 ha! Wow, I guess this fellow didn't realize that presidential elections only take place once every 4 years as well. Classic politics humor. NBC eventually caved. Frank Fahrenkopf Jr., the co-chairman of the Debate Commission, said in an interview that no one from CNN had reached out to him or his colleagues for advice on producing the debate. He said that he had never considered accepting advertising, saying that commercials, quote, change the dynamics for the viewer. So what are Mr. Fahrenkopf's plans for Thursday? I'll probably have a martini and watch, he said. Well, that's important. A guy I don't know. Now I know what he's going to do during the presidential debate. Oh, it really adds a sense of realness. But we know all about Donald Trump. We know all about Joe Biden. Let's spend some time with Dana Bash and Jake Tapper, the moderators. This is Dana Bash's bio on her Wikipedia page. That means this is all approved information. This is the official story on Dana Bash. Dana Ruth Bash is an American journalist, news anchor, and host of Inside Politics and co-anchor of State of the Union on CNN. Bash was born Dana Ruth Schwartz in Manhattan into a Jewish family to Francis Weinman Schwartz, an author and educator in Jewish studies, and Stuart Schwartz, an ABC News producer who served as the senior broadcast producer for Good Morning America. Bash's maternal grandmother, Terry Vidor Weinman, and her family were Hungarian Jews. Weinman escaped to the U.S. with her husband in October 1941, but her parents and her sister were murdered at Auschwitz concentration camp after the occupation of Hungary in 1944. And I'm sure that is a harrowing tale. She received a bachelor's in political communications from George Washington University and was given an honorary doctorate of humane letters from Franklin Pierce in New Hampshire. She interned at NBC, CBS, and CNN. And her professional career of being one of the people who reads the things that everyone has to believe is extremely interesting, but not as interesting as her personal life. From 1998 to 2007, Bash was married to Jeremy Bash, who would become CIA Chief of Staff and Department of Defense Chief of Staff under President Barack Obama. In 2008, she married fellow CNN correspondent John King. Bash gave birth to a son in 2011. She and King divorced in 2012. In 2011, she resigned as a trustee of Jewish Women International under pressure over its abortion rights advocacy. A number of conservative blogs had highlighted the group's position on abortion after Bash accepted the trustee position. So she divorced Jeremy Bash in 2007, married CNN's election screen man in 2008, and then divorced him in 2012. But she still carries Jeremy Bash's last name. Well, who is Jeremy Bash? It turns out that Jeremy Bash is one of the 51 former intelligence officials that signed a letter suggesting that Hunter Biden's laptop was a product of a Russian disinformation effort. Here he is.
Rudy Giuliani was not fed passively Russian disinformation. He ordered it off the menu. He demanded it be brought to him.
Rudy Giuliani, connoisseur in fine Russian disinformation. Now, sure, Dana Bash still carries his last name, and they divorced 17 years ago. So there's probably no connection at all, but it is interesting that she's hosting the debate. It's also interesting that Michael Morrell, who set up that whole 51 former intelligence officials call Hunter Biden's laptop Russian disinformation letter with Antony Blinken, he was on TV over the weekend discussing, quote unquote, new video that just so happens to be 23 years old, but just discovered video that shows Saudi nationals as having something to do with 9/11. And I'm going to try to focus the bulk of tomorrow's episode on the Saudi subject. But of course, in Hunter Biden's recent trial on the gun charges, it was confirmed once again, this time an admission in court, that the information on Hunter Biden's laptop is real. You have to wonder if Joe Biden is going to attempt to lie to the country about that once again. Dana Bash, after the first debate in 2020, called it a hot mess, inside a dumpster fire, inside a train wreck, and a disgrace. She also called it a shit show. And you have to wonder if maybe this debate won't be the anti-shit show. Dana Bash certainly had problems with how that debate went. One would hope she would host the debate she would want to see. And you have to wonder if she has been confined to being able to do only that by the rules. The rules of the debate have been framed as favoring Joe Biden in some way, and that's good because Donald Trump should be able to beat all of these people with his hands tied behind his back. This is not going to be the sort of television event where the media gets to frame everything and then convince the public about what it should believe. The public is actually just going to watch the debate, have their own thoughts, and then probably listen to media coverage after. Maybe they'll track the debate along social media, hoping that the influencers on their side are saying all the right things about how bad Donald Trump is or how bad Joe Biden is or how bad the moderators are. But at least it will be possible to watch the broadcast in a more neutral manner. And it's not only that the experience will be different, it's that the process and the broadcast will not be as much of an issue and as much of a focus. We won't have headlines about outbursts from someone in the crowd or audience reaction at all. We probably won't have a lot of analysis of over-talking and cross-talking and who's interrupting whom. And we certainly won't have any of the claims about how Donald Trump is walking around the stage being menacing to Hillary Clinton. Hopefully we'll just get a relatively neutral debate, and I'll come right back to that in just a couple of minutes. But let's check out our friend Jake Tapper. We'll go to his Wikipedia bio as well. Jacob Paul Tapper is an American journalist, author, and cartoonist. He is the lead Washington anchor for CNN, hosts the weekday television news show The Lead with Jake Tapper, and hosts the Sunday morning public affairs program State of the Union. In his commitment to tough but objective reporting on national politics, Tapper's work continues to make an enormous contribution to the public's understanding of presidential politics, said the American Political Science Association when it honored him with an award in 2017. Oh, yeah, Jake is just the best. Let's skip down to his early life. Tapper was born in New York City and was raised in Queen Village, Philadelphia, the son of Theodore Samuel Ted and Helen Ann née Palmetier Tapper. His mother, who is originally from Canada, retired as a psychiatric nurse at the Philadelphia Veterans Affairs Medical Center. His father, from Chicago, graduated from Dartmouth and Harvard Medical School and went on to serve as president of the South Philadelphia Pediatrics and associate clinical professor of pediatrics at Jefferson Medical College. His parents are Jewish. His mother, who was raised Presbyterian, converted to Judaism. He was named after Jacob Scher. When Tapper was young, he spent summers attending Camp Ramah in the Poconos, a Jewish summer camp. Jacob Scher, by the way, receives at least partial credit for the implementation of the Freedom of Information Act to make it ostensibly possible for citizens to get information about what their government is doing. From the Wikipedia section on Jake Tapper's personal life, Tapper went on a platonic date with Monica Lewinsky in December 1997, a few weeks before news broke of the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal. He wrote about the experience in a January 1998 issue of the Washington City paper, and the two later discussed the date on an October 5th, 2021 episode of his CNN program, The Lead with Jake Tapper. In 2006, Tapper married Jennifer Marie Brown, a former Planned Parenthood official in her home state of Missouri. So that's a whole lot of swamp for both of them. Now, Jack Posobiec this morning was going through all of the elements of Jake Tapper's bias, his dishonesty, and some pretty disastrous television moments. In a series of posts on Telegram and elsewhere, he wrote, "Daily reminder that Jake Tapper's top producer resigned after he was put under investigation by the Fairfax County Child Exploitation Squad. That story is a couple years old. That man's name was Rick Salibi, and that came just shortly after another CNN producer, John Griffin, was arrested and charged with federal crimes involving solicitation of a minor. And while all of these stories are disgusting, that one just seemed particularly creepy." Posobiec went on. "This is how Jake Tapper, next week's debate moderator, reacted to the 2020 results. He called the Trump presidency a time of lies, cruelty, and inhumanity."
Caused and exacerbated by President Trump himself. It's been a time of several significant and utterly avoidable failures, most tragically, of course, the unwillingness to respect facts and science and do everything that can be done to save lives during a pandemic. It has been a time where truth and fact were treated with disdain. It is a time of cruelty where official inhumanity, such as child separation, became the official shameful policy of the United States. But now the Trump presidency is coming to an end. To an end. With so many squandered opportunities and ruined potential, but also an era of just plain meanness. It must be said, to paraphrase President Ford, for tens of millions of our fellow Americans, their long national nightmare is over. Yeah.
And then he passes it back to Dana Bash. "Our long national nightmare is over." Well, that was 3.5 years ago, and it seems like their long national nightmare has continued because they are all losing their shit constantly. It's becoming clear that the American public genuinely dislikes these people. And it's also becoming clear that the Trump movement is building, not diminishing, so the nightmare is going to continue for a very long time. Posobiec links to a tweet of Jake Tapper praising the Ukraine impeachment hoax. He links to a video with Jake Tapper falsely reporting about the Russiagate dossier. He adds in Jake Tapper asking that the CNN cameras be turned off because Trump was being greeted by Cubans at a Cuban restaurant. And he comes to this one from Jake Tapper on X, formerly Twitter, and was Twitter when he wrote it. October 30th, 2020. Since Twitter has locked out the New York Post for violating rules that no longer stand as rules, but Twitter won't revisit past enforcement decisions, the New York Post could end this standoff by deleting the tweets that broke the rules, thus unlocking its account, then tweet them out again. You see that? Just comply a little bit. Just comply a little bit. Now, all of this is quite obviously an info op. There is an anti-Jake Tapper effort taking place. Jack Posobiec is leading it. Jack Posobiec, love him, hate him, like him, don't care. He still runs info ops online. So rather than getting mad at him, it's better to just figure out what the op is and what it intends to accomplish. One last clip from Jake Tapper. Poso writes, Jake Tapper has directly compared Trump to Hitler many times. Here's a compilation of just a few. He is moderating the CNN debates this week.
Dehumanizing rhetoric of Adolf Hitler is once again alive and well on a national political stage. This time, of course, in the United States. Donald Trump, a couple times over the weekend, referred to immigrants from South America, Africa, and Asia. He did not mention Europe. South America, Africa, and Asia as, quote, poisoning the blood of our country, which it's not hyperbole. That does very directly echo Adolf Hitler's language before World War II. To open up a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf, you would find the Nazi leader describing the mixing of non-Germans with Germans as poisoning. There's really no other way to say it. Donald Trump's language mirrors this directly.
So, okay, let's leave the substance of those claims aside for now. We'll have plenty of time to talk about them because right now there is actually a widespread internet op doing some strange pro-Nazi thing. I think Burning Bright and I will be talking about that tomorrow night on Badlands Story Hour when we discuss the movie Captain America: Winter Soldier. But the point here for now is that Jake Tapper has a long history of being publicly and vehemently anti-Trump and also being proven blatantly wrong about the factual claims he uses to support his positions. And all of this is in response to a segment from CNN this morning with Kasie Hunt featuring Trump campaign spokesperson Caroline Leavitt. And here that is. This clip has gone extremely viral, I guess, to dunk on the media. I think there might be something else going on here, but let's take a listen to the clip.
What's going to happen?
Joining me now is Caroline Leavitt. She is Trump campaign national press secretary. Caroline, thanks very much for being here on the show. We played that to remind everyone that that was some of what they saw on the debate stage in 2020. Of course, President Trump went on to lose that election to Joe Biden. Can you tell us what Donald Trump is going to do differently on the debate stage this time?
Sure. Well, President Trump is well prepared ahead of Thursday's debates. Unlike Joe Biden, he doesn't have to hide away and have his advisors tell him what to say. President Trump knows what he wants to say, and he's going to relay his vision to the American people to make this country strong, safe, secure, and wealthy again. He's been doing that across this great nation to all corners of this country. That's why he was in Detroit, Michigan last week. He was in Philadelphia for a big rally on Saturday night. And that's why President Trump is knowingly going into a hostile environment on this very network on CNN with debate moderators who have made their opinions about him very well known over the past 8 years and their biased coverage of him. So President Trump is willing to bring his message to every corner of this country, to voters, to ensure that he wins this election in November. He looks forward to doing that. And I know the American public look forward to hearing from him.
So I'll just say my colleagues, Jake Tapper and Dana Bash, have acquitted themselves as professionals as they have covered campaigns and interviewed candidates from all sides of the aisle. I'll also say that if you talk to analysts of debates previous, that if you're attacking the moderators, you're usually losing. So I really want to focus in on what these two men are going to do and say when they stand on the stage. Now, we have a little bit of what Donald Trump, your boss, has said in trying to set expectations for this debate. I want to play a series of his comments, and then we'll talk about it. Watch.
Well, maybe I'm better off losing the debate. I'll make sure he says I'll lose the debate on purpose. Maybe I'll do something like that.
I assume he's going to be somebody that will be a worthy debater.
Should I be tough and nasty and just say you're the worst president in history? Or
Should I be nice and calm and let him speak?
So he's basically saying there, well, will I let Joe Biden win? It does seem as though many Republicans have set the bar very low in terms of arguing that Joe Biden is basically senile. Now you have people like Doug Burgum coming out and saying, well, President Biden's very accomplished, trying to set expectations in a different place. What do you expect from Joe Biden?
Well, first of all, it takes someone 5 minutes to Google Jake Tapper, Donald Trump, to see that Jake Tapper has consistently,
we're going to stop this interview if you're going to keep attacking my colleagues. Ma'am, I'm going to stop this interview if you continue to attack my colleagues. I would like to talk about Joe Biden and Donald Trump, who you work for.
Yes.
If you are here to speak on his behalf, I am willing to have this conversation.
I am stating facts that your colleagues have stated in the past.
Okay.
Now,
I'm sorry, guys. We're going to come back out to the panel. Caroline, thank you very much for your time. You are welcome to come back at any point. She is welcome to come back and speak about Donald Trump, and Donald Trump will have equal time to Joe Biden when they both join us now at later this week in Atlanta for this debate. Our thanks to Caroline.
All right, so that clip has gone extremely viral today. Kasie Hunt seems like she's absolutely shell-shocked. I don't know why she would get that upset. This seems to be one of those things that's set up in advance, or maybe she's got a producer in her ear making sure that Levitt can't say anything bad about Jake Tapper. All of this is being focused on the effect of the moderators on the debate, what's going to happen in the debate. CNN is making the issue of the day why Donald Trump is trying to change and lower expectations on himself in order to change the baseline perception of Joe Biden's performance. But something else in Kasie Hunt's very strange and seemingly scripted response. And again, these people do have producers in their ear. It is totally possible that a producer said something in her ear and she repeated it out on television. That's not an unusual thing. But what caught my ear is this here at the end.
Caroline, thank you very much for your time. You are welcome to come back at any point. She is welcome to come back and speak about Donald Trump, and Donald Trump will have equal time to Joe Biden when they both join us now at later this week in Atlanta for this debate.
Okay, so Kasie Hunt cuts Caroline Levitt off, ends her segment, and says that Donald Trump will be given equal time at CNN's debate on Thursday. And equal time has been a focus of Donald Trump for many years. There's this headline, October 7th, 2017. Trump cites FCC equal time rule in dig at unfunny late night comedians. President Donald Trump mused Saturday morning about whether he and his fellow Republicans should receive equal time on TV due to what he sees as consistently unfair coverage from late night comedians. Late night hosts are dealing with the Democrats for their very unfunny, repetitive material, always anti-Trump. Should we get equal time? Trump wrote on Twitter Saturday. He later added, more and more people are suggesting that Republicans and me should be given equal time on TV when you look at the one-sided coverage. Trump appears to be referencing the FCC's equal time rule, which has been applied to broadcast TV and radio stations and locally originated cable TV. The rule requires broadcasters to treat legally qualified politically candidates fairly in both free airtime from appearances and paid advertising, with exemptions for programs like newscasts. The president also seems to be implying that the equal time provision might apply to commentaries, like Jimmy Kimmel's monologues on healthcare, which have lambasted the president and Republicans. Kimmel, host of ABC's Late Night Show, responded to the president on Twitter by jokingly agreeing that Trump should have more airtime on TV if he did one thing: quit the presidency. You should quit that boring job. I'll let you have my show all to yourself. #MAGA, Kimmel wrote. And so what Trump was highlighting here was that these network television organizations that relied on the public airwaves, they have a whole special set of laws all to themselves. And nonetheless, they go out every night and their late night hosts pitch a message that is explicitly anti the duly elected president. But it wasn't always Trump fighting for that. Let's go back even further. This is The Atlantic on October 22nd, 2015. So a year before Trump was even elected. FCC chief vows to require equal time on TV for candidates. The head of the Federal Communications Commission promised Thursday to enforce his agency's regulations requiring television stations to give political candidates equal opportunities for airtime. The rules are pretty clear. Rules are rules, FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler told reporters. I hope that we have developed a reputation as folks who enforce rules. Hillary Clinton's appearance earlier this month on Saturday Night Live could trigger the so-called equal time rules, as could Donald Trump's plan to host the long-running NBC comedy show next month. That doesn't necessarily mean Lincoln Chafee will be the host of SNL, but it could mean that local NBC affiliates across the country will have to give presidential candidates access to equal TV time. Under a law passed in 1934, the FCC requires broadcast television and radio stations, but not cable channels, to give equal opportunities to legally qualified candidates. The law exempts news shows, which the FCC has broadly interpreted to include talk shows like The Tonight Show. So this has been an issue for many years. Here is an article from Pointer.org. This is a philanthropist-sponsored fact-checking organization. So as regime as can be, they run the International Fact-Checking Network that claims to promote excellence in fact-checking to more than 100 organizations worldwide through advocacy, training, and global events. They basically enforce the official story and their version of ethics online. Do the networks have to give equal time? In a word, no. And I'm not going to go through all of this. The idea of equal time is born out of the regulation that has to do with political advertising. Simply put, if a broadcast station sells ad time or offers free time to a candidate for an office, it has to offer similar access to other qualified candidates. The equal time rule still exists today, but the fairness doctrine does not. And you may have noticed the mention of selling ad time in that description and how much a focus it was of that New York Times article. How weird it is that ads are being sold. Again, it says, simply put, if a broadcast station sells ad time or offers free time to a candidate for office, it has to offer similar access to other qualified candidates. They are selling ad time. The FCC abolished the Fairness Doctrine in 1987. The regulation stretched back to the Radio Act of 1927 that mandated broadcast license holder serve the public interest. In 1949, the FCC introduced the Fairness Doctrine regulation just as the FCC was issuing broadcast licenses, and when 3 TV networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS, ruled the television airwaves. The government said it wanted to promote a basic standard of fairness for what was being broadcast. Congress worried that without regulation, the networks could set their own agenda and no other voices would be heard. Congress kept the concept of the Fairness Doctrine in the 1959 Communications Act. In the 1970s, the FCC considered, in fact said, the Fairness Doctrine was the single most important requirement of operation in the public interest, the sine qua non for grant of a renewal of license. Stations would keep track of the number of minutes and seconds they dedicated to controversial issues to be sure they could document that they had given equal time to opposing voices. It was ingrained in broadcast journalists like me to get to the other side of the story, even if the other side was a knucklehead. Today, we might call it false balance, but it was law then. In 1959, senators had a lot to say about regulating fairness. The Senate report supporting enforced fairness included this passage. Broadcast frequencies are limited, and therefore they have been necessarily considered a public trust. Every licensee who is fortunate in obtaining a license is mandated to operate in the public interest and has assumed the obligation of presenting important public questions fairly and without bias. So back then, we got our television on the public airwaves, and we got our radio on the public airwaves. The author goes into some discussion about how people feel about these things, but let's skip closer to the end. The FCC enforced the Fairness Doctrine right up to Ronald Reagan's second term, but other things were happening. In 1985, the FCC said the Fairness Doctrine was having a quote-unquote chilling effect on freedom of speech. Cable TV was finding its voice, and talk radio was boiling with criticism for Reagan. Another important and less acknowledged thing was going on. In the late 1980s, it became easier for broadcasters to transmit signals via satellite, which made it easier for national syndicators to distribute programs. Radio stations found it cheaper to pipe in a syndicated program than to hire local talent. In 1987, the FCC repealed most of the Fairness Doctrine. In 2011, all of the doctrine's provisions died. So that was under Obama, and the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act was soon to follow. Many times since, members of Congress, mostly Democrats, have tried to revive the doctrine, which would require conservative talk radio, for example, to provide equal voices to Rush Limbaugh. Conservatives called it the Hush-Rush Bill. Remember, cable TV content is not regulated as over-the-air broadcasts are because cable does not use the public airwaves. So tonight, TV stations, radio stations, and cable networks can make whatever decision they wish about whether to provide equal time to the Democrats. The legal considerations are different from the ethical considerations, of course. I got a note from Andrew J. Schwartzman at the Georgetown University Law Center who said, outside of the personal attack scenario, the Fairness Doctrine never would have required broadcasters to afford time to any particular speaker. Broadcasters could comply by presenting any opposing viewpoint, either by inviting someone with an opposing viewpoint or by having their own reporters or commentators to present counter-arguments. In that sense, it is quite likely that, even without giving time to Pelosi or Schumer, the broadcasters probably will do whatever the Fairness Doctrine might have required in their overall programming over the next several days. It is interesting that in 2007, Congress was considering the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Act. The bill would have built 300 miles of vehicle barriers along the Mexican border, along with 15 camera and radar towers, and would have hired 20,000 border agents. It would also have made it easier for undocumented immigrants to become citizens. Talk radio went wall to wall attacking the plan, which died in the U.S. Senate. Talk radio hosts took credit for its death. That was the last time anybody made a serious effort to reinstate the Fairness Doctrine. It was Mississippi Senator Trent Lott who said memorably, "Talk radio is running America. We have to do something about that problem." Now, it seems to me like many of these things will become major issues in the future, particularly if I am right about things like Starlink, and this represents a parallel comms infrastructure that doesn't rely on organizations like Amazon Web Services and all of the cable companies to transmit our information for us and, by the way, keep it for themselves at the same time. If we are looking to satellite transmission from Starlink to the ground, from peer to peer, using that as the only middleman, rather than internet service providers and the people who own the infrastructure and Amazon Web Services, etc., then we may all find ourselves communicating regularly on what are ostensibly public airwaves, which means all of this would become an issue again in the future. And I think that's really interesting when it turns out that this viral clip from Caroline Leavitt and Kasie Hunt this morning includes Kasie Hunt promising, as a host of CNN, equal time with the candidates, especially in the midst of all those other rules and changes away from the model we've all gotten accustomed to. And then there's also this. The Fairness Doctrine went away in 1987. Let's go back to the New York Times article we went through at the beginning of this. CNN outmaneuvered its competitors to land the event after Mr. Biden said in May that he would not cooperate with the Commission on Presidential Debates, which had sponsored general election debates since 1987. Now, is it all connected? I don't know. I'm not suggesting that on this 1987 thing, though it is a very interesting correlation. But as for the rest, we know a few things. 1, fake election in 2020. 2, fake presidency. 3, fake campaign. Because 4, fake election again. Now, it would be great if everybody figured everything out and we could just have a real election, or perhaps evolve in the form of our government and the form of our society and take that next step, although I don't think we're probably there yet. This debate is already functioning as a nationwide exposure of everything Joe Biden, not to mention these moderators. So there are a whole range of narrative goals that have virtually nothing to do with whether Trump beats Biden or Biden beats Trump and how that's going to make a difference 5.5 months from now. In a fake election that we have every reason to believe is rigged, Donald Trump hasn't even conceded for 2020. Joe Biden's not legitimate. We don't know that Joe Biden's going to be the candidate. Donald Trump is supposed to be heading to prison. The RNC is wanting to replace him. There are so many unknowns between now and November that analyzing all of this as if it's some normal, real political practice that's going to have the biggest impact on the biggest presidential race of all time, all of that is just silly. Now, it's worth noting that there has never been a presidential debate before the middle of September, and now we're doing one at the end of June. But despite all that weirdness, let's just do the traditional television political analysis and not consider the other narratives that are in play here. I have suggested countless times that I believe what we are witnessing is an unwinding of all of these various corruptions that have been implemented over decades, sometimes over centuries, by that global regime and their uniparty representation here in the United States of America. We just talked about a bunch of examples of that with these Supreme Court cases, and about how the activist left and the administrative state and the deep state use our judicial process to change laws in ways they could never accomplish through the election process and the proper legislative process to pass laws that are constitutional. They've already upended our system of government and are using these extra constitutional means to implement their agenda. So we have the political and legal processes to accomplish that. That stuff is in process. But in the meantime, the story has to be told to the public so the public can understand and, in fact, desire for these things to be the right way. So what we're getting essentially right now is the 2020 debate that was a shit show represented for the American public in a way that might present the contrast between these two candidates without all the extraneous bullshit that we get from the mainstream media and other cultural channels trying to convince people that what they watched with their own eyes and heard with their own ears was actually the opposite of what you saw. Whatever you saw, whatever you felt, whatever you took away from that, we're going to make sure you know that the right response was the opposite response to the one you had. And so that's going to make you uninformed, maybe racist, maybe homophobic, certainly a violent extremist. Whatever narrative they need for their candidate at that time, they're going to make sure that you believe that thing no matter what it is you watched. You might remember after that original debate between Trump and Biden, hosted by Chris Wallace, everybody spent their time talking about stand back and stand by. Donald Trump's awkward comments after Joe Biden and Chris Wallace teamed up to attempt to put words in his mouth, words that they would then use to press their case about Trump supporters being terrorists after the very violent insurrection. That was the focus of that debate. Not any of the points Donald Trump made against Joe Biden, but we're going to have a different format this time. And the country now knows a whole lot more about Joe Biden and about Donald Trump. And I expect the rules to benefit Biden and the moderators to back him and oppose Trump. But hey, at least they're going to get equal time. And thank goodness for that viral clip, or I would have never thought of this. And hey, maybe that's the point. I'll be back tomorrow at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. And Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. Comes out to under a quarter per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree. linktree.com/I'm your moderator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's